So in today's web dev tip, we're going to make a start on our stats app in our Rick and Roll project. And we're first going to take a look at how we're actually going to work out which URL the user is interested in viewing stats for. So we're not actually going to put any password protection or login or any authentication for this. We're simply just going to have a route on our stats app where you can access information about it. So it's not very secure, but we're just simply showing some information about those stats. And there's no private or personal information being stored, so for the purposes of our project, we're just going to leave off that part of the whole login process and authentication. But as I said, we need to work out which URL we're actually interested in viewing stats for, and there's a couple of different ways we can do that. It's got to be something in the actual URL itself, because we're not providing any other means of identifying which user has created a particular short URL. So, for example, in our stats app, we could do something like stats-/1234, and then if we look at the actual URL, and we can do that in our console here just by accessing the location object that's inside of the window object. And as you can see here, we've got lots of information about the particular URL that we're visiting at the moment. And we've got this path name here. So we could potentially split that string to work out this 1234, which would be the ID of the particular URL that we're interested in viewing stats for. So for example, we could say window location path name and dot split on a /, for example. And you can see there the third item in the array. So if we were accessing the index position number 2, would give us that ID. So it's a bit clunky. If you're using a front-end framework, there's lots of tools in place to actually do this better for you. But because we're not doing that, we're just using pure JavaScript and TypeScript. We'll have to do something like this if that's the approach that we want to take. The other option that we've got as well is to investigate or interrogate the query parameters of the particular URL that we're visiting. So we could, for example, do something like this. We could say, using a question mark, we'll specify any query parameters to the request, and we'll say the URL ID is 1234 again. And if we do that and have a look at the window.location object again, if we have a look down here, there's also now a search property on that object, which gives us everything after the search parameters. And there are some objects that you can use within JavaScript to parse this rather than doing a split. So we could take that approach as well. But for me, that looks a little bit more messier than the other approach. And of course, you've got that extra work as well to parse the URL rather than doing a simple split on the path name string. So either option is fine, really. But I think for our purposes, we're going to go with the path name. And so basically all of our URLs will be at /stats in our application, / and then the ID of the URL that we want to visit. So in the next tutorial, what we're going to do is we're going to take that path property that we're parsing from the URL and then send a request to the API endpoint that we created a few tutorials ago to actually get those stats, and that'll be loading the stats data onto the page, and then we'll have it available for us to start generating the actual contents to show the user. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.